ready to fall down the hillside. There is more or less finished. Little bit of the plastic sheeting just to give privacy for the first days. The families are then expected to upgrade. And you can see again, this is the edge of the cliff. And you can see the rest of the slum area with self-built blue sheets, canopies going there. In a place where people used to be. And why? Why happened to that photo? Hey, that photo that we were supposed to save, we didn't save. Right, there is no photo there. There is a story, however. What happened to that shelter was that we came back about a week later, and already, yes, there'd been some little bits of wood put around the outside, and you could go in and there was some furniture, and there was a little sign on the door of the shelter. A little sign on the door of the shelter said in Creole, tonight's showing will be at 7 o'clock for five goods. And the woman who owned the shelter had got a little TV set and had somehow got some electricity from somewhere. And it was not just a shelter, it was a cinema. She still lived there, the baby was there, the bed was there, but this was how she was making her money, showing, I have no idea what videos, but a little sign was there. It wasn't quite a multiplex, but it was the way that she was making money to pay to buy food for her child. And so it wasn't just a shelter, it was a livelihood support, if you like. It was what was helping her feed herself and her family. And it's a sort of livelihood support, the sort of her strategy, which is very urban. You don't have cinemas out in the fields, maybe in America, but you do in urban areas where you have thousands and thousands of people, some of whom might want to go to the cinema, some of whom might want to see a film, and where you can get electricity from somewhere. And so she was very happy here. I mean, she might have wanted something bigger, better, something to have more people coming to watch the cinema. But that's where she wanted to be. Even though this was designed to be transitional, transferable, transitable, movable, she was wanting to be there because that's where she knew everybody. That's where she would get people coming in. That's where she knew where the shops were for the cheap food. Even though she was on the edge of the ravine. But she wanted to be there because that was part of her living, her urban livelihoods. And about that, there is no really good guidance. If you look, the space between where she is and the next shelter is sufficiently distant to stop her falling ill or getting communicable diseases. But it's not an urban planned, it's not a planned area. In some ways, the big problem, going back to this photo one last time, is that none of it was planned. Most of it is being reinforced and rebuilt. Some people may move out of here, but some people eventually may not. And what does the guidelines say that there should be a minimum space between all the shelters? That there should be a minimum amount of clean water? That there should be a minimum distance between shelters and latrines, or maximum? distance between shelters and retreats. If it's going to be impossible to put a permanent retreat anywhere on that slope anyway. What are the unknown unknowns? What are the problems that we haven't even figured out yet when we are trying to then come along a few months later, when people have made these shelters bigger and better, put all of their money into it, but made the shelters bigger, better, but not safer, not more sustainable? What are the challenges? What are the gaps? What do we not know? What do we need to look for in a situation like this? Because this is not the worst. Port-au-Prince is a city of only 2.7 million people. There's plenty of cities in worse situations which are 10 million people or 15 million people. How big is Holland these days? 16 million? Yeah. Tehran, I think, is about 13 or 14 million. So imagine most of Holland in a single city which is on an earthquake fault, on a hillside, where 70 to 90% of the buildings are going to fall down. Like Tehran. What do you do? Anyway, that's the end of the presentation.
David, Jim, could you share a little bit of your discussion last night this morning about what you guys care? You were jumping with care, but you were, say, focused on one of the biggest shelter programs together.
Yeah, I think one of the things you have to do is, in some ways, bridge the span between having something which is individually adaptable, which is very, very micro, and at the same time, which is big enough to have an impact. That is, that the Care International, one of the NGOs that I work for, has as one of its principles that it will do programs if it can be significant. If it can make a difference. Now, if you have a place like Haiti where 130,000 families lost their house, then if you are only giving out 500 shelters or 1,000 shelters, less than 1%, are you being significant? And so the first thing is to think big, or to try and think as big as possible, or to think of the one point which will have the biggest change. And so for CARE, we started off giving out very much emergency distributions, same as a lot of the other organizations. Plastic sheeting, buckets, blankets, rope, things that people could just quickly put over their heads. We then also worked very closely with Cordate, who did all of the hard work and all of the design work and all of the methodology development. To do what you saw there, the transitional shelters, the small wooden frame huts. But because of all of the space problems, it was not going to be possible to do all of those wooden huts, those transitional shelters, for a large number of people before the first rains and the first possible hurricanes came. Or before they just found something else. Or before they decided that they were never going to move, they just keep on upgrading the local shelter. So in the end, we also did another 20,000 kits of materials which were supposed to reinforce self-built shelters. So if people are building their own shelters, most of the way they were building was adding more and more things onto the external surface, onto the skin, onto the outside. So they'd add wooden plywood or metal sheets or more metal roofs or a door, something which would make it look like a house, something which would give them dignity, something which would give them more privacy, but something when the wind comes would blow away, and then you have metal sheets flying through the air at high speed. And then when metal sheets fly through the air at high speed, sometimes they do that. They kill people. So we looked at materials which could be adapted by 20,000 families to brace or to tie down all of the self-built shelters, along with a series of different trainings, posters, technical advice, just walking around and around and around the neighbourhoods, making sure that everybody had got it done one way or the other. And stuff which was designed so it could be reused, so it could be taken away, so it could be used again for other things when people were moving out of the camps or moving back to their old places, or if they were building where they were. I think one other thing to say about the situation in Haiti, particularly in the more dense urban areas, is, with reference again to the minimum standards, to the idea that everybody has to have a lot of space, is if you go and look in some of the urban slums, which didn't fall down, you'll notice that most people built their old urban slum homes more or less about that big, and more or less about that big, and the space between is more or less that big. It was human dimensions. And if you look at the aerial views of the camps taken by Google Earth across January, February, March, April of 2010, you see that, yes, in the end, a lot of the camps were very densely packed. It was in part because the UN or the NGOs were giving out food or water or medicine or other things in the camps. But at the beginning, there was still space, but people were quite close to each other already. And it wasn't because there wasn't enough space all the time. It's because that's how they measured their old homes. And they just moved somewhere else and done it again. Now, the problem is, you keep on doing that, and the winds keep on coming, and it keeps on blowing away. Or you keep on doing that, and then you have more and more rubbish and more dirty water going in between until everybody gets cholera. But the question is, if that's what the natural, well, I won't say natural, that's what the standard way of figuring out how much space you want is, how do you then go back and figure out from there, where do we go? From there, how do we get somewhere which is going to be clean? From there, how do we figure out what's not going to fall down, blow away? From there, what do we do? And I think this is the challenge, that everybody is in some sort of shelter. The challenge is that those shelters are not sustainable and not part of a larger plan. It's still very individualized.
I want you to save your questions, because I want to go through the 3 presentations and then ask you guys we'll have a small bit of a discussion forum after that. So whether your questions, we're dealing with a thematic called urban emergencies responses. So response means anything from relief to redevelopment, from the acute phase to the middle phase to the long-term phase. If you have questions regarding how the community was involved, to what information was exchanged between